That sounds fishy.
It is.
So everyone is waiting for a quorum, we need 5 people for a quorum, so we're waiting for the 5th member.
Thanks. He said he was waiting just to get all the mics turned down.
I think you're okay. I took it off, so I think you're okay.
All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to what was supposed to be the September 10th Planning Commission. I'm terribly sorry to say that we were unable to have a quorum this evening, which means that we will not be able to pass any motions on the public hearings this evening. What we are going to have to do is we're going to continue the first public hearing to regarding the Bella Reeve development to the September 24th Planning Commission meeting. Since you all took the time to come out here this evening, and we very much appreciate that, staff and the city attorney has volunteered to give an informational presentation that they were going to be providing to us as part of the public hearing. If anybody would like to stay around in order to see that presentation, they can certainly stay and watch that. We just unfortunately cannot have any public hearing or discussion or have any motion on that item. So that meeting will have to be continued to the September 24th Planning Commission meeting as well. And we need to have a motion for
That's
that.
correct. So the only action you can officially take is to have a motion to continue both items to the next meeting. And then the official meeting of the Planning Commission will be over, and we would, for whoever stays, we'd be more than happy to give you the same information we would have during the public hearing, answer questions, listen to what you have to say, but Planning Commission simply can't act as an official body tonight because of the lack of a quorum.
So that being said, for the second public hearing on the MAC development sites, the request for a text amendment to Chapter 3 of the city's comprehensive guide plan, which will identify airport commercial and airport office zoning for the proposed parcels which are currently guided airport, a text amendment to Chapter 5 on the city's comprehensive guide plan relating to safety zones, and a text amendment to Chapter 11 of the city code to create an airport office and airport commercial zoning districts. I will entertain a motion for continuance.
Mr. Chairman, move to recommend a continuance to the September 24th, 2012 meeting.
Second. Having heard a second, all those in favor say aye. Aye. The motion is continued. And with that, if people would like to stay around for the city presentation, staff presentation, they're more than welcome. Again, we apologize for this inconvenience.
I'm Rick Rosso. I'm the city attorney for Eden Prairie, and wanted tonight to tell you how it is that we're here considering development by the Metropolitan Airports Commission, commonly referred to as MAC, on airport property, and what is being proposed and how we got there. And then Mr. Franzen, the city planner, will tell you in more detail about the process that we'll be following. So I'll first kind of set the ground work for you in terms of how we're here and what the discussions have been over the last 2.5 years with the Metropolitan Airports Commission. It really starts back in 1992. My office sent a letter to the Attorney General and asked for an opinion from the Attorney General with respect to the city's authority to regulate through its zoning regulations and codes airport property used for aeronautical purposes. And what was happening at that time was that MAC was looking at the expansion of the runways, and they were going to be acquiring property for that expansion, property that prior to their acquisition was subject to city zoning and subdivision regulations. But MAC took the position that after they acquired that property, that it was no longer subject to city zoning and regulatory processes. And so there is a process under state law where the city attorney, on his or her own initiative, can ask the Attorney General of the state for an opinion as to questions of law. And so we did that. And the Attorney General wrote back and basically summarized it in the second paragraph of the letter, and I'll read that to you. You inquire about the authority of the city to enforce its zoning and subdivision regulations with respect to land acquired by MAC for airport uses. Applying a balancing of public interest test to the resolution of this conflict between the exercise by these governmental entities of their respective powers, it is my opinion that the city would likely be deemed without authority to enforce these regulations with respect to property acquired by MAC for those purposes. So that was 1992, and we've lived with that opinion for all these years. MAC eventually went ahead and expanded the runways. During that acquired property, expanded the runways, and during that entire period of time, we had many negotiations with them that resulted in a memorandum of understanding about the expansion of the runways and the kinds of reporting and limitations that they would voluntarily put on the airport operations. So about 2 years ago, MAC approached us and said we would like to, and we are planning to do some development of property that we own and we want to do some commercial development. And we don't want to just spring this on you. We don't want to surprise you by this. We want to talk to you about it. And actually, we'd like to enter into another memorandum of understanding with you, city, over what that process would look like and how that would proceed. So, Mr. Franzen, how do I get the PowerPoint up? Okay, I've been locked out. So Mr. Franzen will get me back in. All right. I've only been here since '78, so they don't trust me with those passwords yet. So.
Just go to slideshow.
Slideshow, right.
I got one thing right.
All right, great, thank you. So this is a similar presentation that we've made to the City Council twice, once about 2 years ago and once several months ago. The composition of the council had changed, and so we wanted to bring the current council up to speed with respect to what proposals they would see coming forward through the Planning Commission from the Metropolitan Airports Commission. So as I said, MAC proposed in 2010 development at the airport. And they proposed a process whereby they would solicit city staff input as to the appropriate uses. They would convene public meetings such as this. They wouldn't be public hearings, but they'd be public meetings where residents could come out and give their opinions with respect to those items. They would incorporate city design standards into their developments. For commercial purposes, the city has design standards, 75% brick and glass, those kinds of things for new development. They would take the city and staff comments and forward them to their board. And then they would and their board would then decide what they were going to do with respect to development. Now, their board is essentially appointed by the governor. And the MAC board would then select their developer, do their development, and they would ask for our cooperation on infrastructure improvements, sewer and water improvements that would be needed on the roads in order to service those developments, as we would do with any development in the city. We thought about that proposal for a little bit and thought that doesn't look very much like the kind of process that our citizens are accustomed to seeing, with public hearings, opportunity for input, a decision of recommendation or not recommendation by the Planning Commission. Whatever the Planning Commission does, that's brought to the City Council. The City Council holds hearings and then makes a decision about a development. And I've made reference as to the number of years that my firm has represented the city, and I can think of only one development perhaps in all those years that just flat out got turned down. It's a cooperative process whereby the council and the staff work with developers to, and there's a give and take in terms of mostly a give by the developer, a take by the city, of complying with the city code, and then reasonable variances or waivers to accommodate special needs of a particular development. But most developments go through. And so we thought, it would be better to have a process that, one, the council is familiar with and the citizens are familiar with, where we have the right to say yes or no. And so we proposed that back to them. We proposed a traditional development process, a process that recognizes that non-aeronautical uses, a commercial office building for non-aeronautical uses, is different from what the Attorney General was talking about. Now, that's my opinion. That's not Mac's opinion. But, and that, therefore, we would have authority to zone with respect to non-aeronautical uses. And again, I can't emphasize enough that the Metropolitan Airports Commission doesn't agree with that particular opinion. The Metropolitan Airports Commission identified originally 8 sites, and they've narrowed it down to 6 sites at which they'd like to see this development. So we said we'd look at 8 sites, now it's 6 sites, and we'd have a process of public hearings. And tonight was the first public hearing that we'd be holding for citizens to hear the proposals and then provide their comment, and then for the Planning Commission to make a recommendation back to the council. The process would provide for zoning and rezoning, site plan approval, everything that we do with any other project. The process that we eventually have arrived at is that we need, in order to allow the council to consider this, we have to first, and that is what tonight's public hearing was about, have a text amendment to the city code in the zoning section to allow for airport commercial districts and airport commercial airport office. We realized as we were going through the process that we had to put a step in front of that we had to amend our guide plan. And so we need a guide plan amendment. So tonight's hearing was to consider a text amendment to the guide plan to acknowledge these 2 new zoning districts and to provide for that in the text, and then a text amendment to the zoning code that would add these new districts into the zoning code. No rezoning of property would take place as a result of this part of the process. It would be separate from any other part of the process. So that is what the Planning Commission was going to be asked to consider tonight. Now, those parcels are identified on this map, and it may be difficult to see them. There are 8 of them, and I realize that this is not an iPad, and I can't point my finger, and it won't show up on the screen. But they are spread out around the periphery of the airport, and the materials that you I hopefully have taken from the back when you walked in has a map that will identify those parcels for you. Parcel 1 and Parcel 8 are the 2 parcels that have dropped out of consideration. So MAC was proposing airport office and commercial, and this slide shows that parcels 2 and 6 were the office proposed sites, and the other parcels 3, 4, 5, and 7 were the commercial parcels. So as part of this whole process, then back in 2010, we did enter into a memorandum of understanding. And it basically said that if the city goes ahead and rezones in accordance with this request, that MAC would not challenge our authority to impose our zoning on them. And that if a parcel is rezoned, and this was perhaps one of the most important points for the city, was that if the parcel was rezoned, it was subject to our site plan and architectural review process. So at that point, we've approved the use of the parcel for a particular type of use, but when the actual proposal is made, we want to put this type of office building there, then all the regulations of the city with respect to setback and height, color of brick, all of those kinds of issues are still subject to our process. And what MAC gets out of this entire process is they get approval to go forward with their development without a fight with the city. And what we get out of it is we get the authority to impose our site plan and architectural review process on these developments to ensure to the extent possible that they are compatible with and do not interfere with the surrounding uses, the enjoyment of the surrounding uses. And really what both parties get out of it is we avoid a battle over who has the zoning authority. MAC has, as a result of this Attorney General's opinion, the opinion that we do not have the authority to zone their property. If we took a position and said, yes, we do, and just stuck with it and said, we're not going to enter into a memorandum of understanding, we're going to tell you that you don't have the authority to do that, I can practically guarantee to you that they would have moved forward with their proposal. And they wouldn't have sued us. They didn't need to do that. They just would have moved forward. And then it would have been up to the city council to decide, all right, what do we do in response to that? How do we prevent them from doing that? And the only way I know how to prevent them from doing that would have been a lawsuit. And so we would have been involved in a lawsuit, tied up in the courts for at least several years, and asking a third party, a judge or a jury, to decide whether we had the zoning authority. And that would have been expensive for both sides. And so the idea of entering into a cooperative process where we both gave up a little bit in terms of what we thought we had the right to do in order to both maintain a position that, one, we think we have the authority to zone and we want to go through our process. And if, in fact, the council says yes, and I don't know tonight whether the council will say yes. Okay, so the council hasn't made a decision on this. But if the council says yes, then MAC is bound. If the council says no, I'm going to have the same discussion with the council, and I've already had it once, we'll have it again, that if you say no, then this is what we can expect will happen. but that's the council's choice. That's a policy decision for the council to make. At that point, staff and the city attorney, we step back and let the council make the decision. The MOU with respect to all of this, the memorandum is binding only if the city proceeds forward and rezones. Either party can cancel the MOU, but we get to the point where we rezoned and they're proceeding, we don't have to worry about cancellation. This map shows the 6 parcels a little better in color for you, the green parcels, and then the orange parcels as well, which is what we're talking about, airport commercial and airport office. So at that, what I'd like to do is to ask Mr. Franzen to discuss with you this next part of the presentation, which is an explanation not only of what would have happened tonight in terms of the public hearing, a portion of which we're doing informally, but then when we actually do have the public hearing, there'll be a recommendation to the council and what will happen at the council, and then there'll be subsequent public hearings with respect to the rest of the process, because as I said, tonight's action and any action of the council based upon an action that would have taken place tonight, one way or the other, doesn't result in zoning, only results in changing the language of the code, and then more was necessary. So, Mr. Franzen, if you'd make that presentation.
You covered about 90%.
I didn't mean to preempt you.
I've got a large book, but I'm not going through the whole thing. For those of you that may not have gotten here early enough to get a copy of this staff report, if you go on to the city website and you click on the city calendar and you click on the Planning Commission meeting date, you'll have a list of all of these attachments there, so if you want to download them later on your own computer, they'll be available there, or you could send an email directly to the Planning Department and we can email you a copy of everything that's in this staff report here this evening. We have a 3-step process that's going to take approximately 1 year. And before someone can build anything in the city, you have to have zoning standards in place. And these are the rules and regulations by which we will judge any future building on any of these 6 parcels at the airport. Before you can adopt any official zoning regulation, the Met Council says you have to have a relationship to your comprehensive guide plan. And part of what that is, and you can read along in your staff report, it's a text amendment to page 3-4 of the land use chapter of the guide plan. And in our land use chapter, we identify all the different land uses in Eden Prairie. And for any of you in this room that own a single-family home, your land is guided low-density residential, but it may have a different zoning district. And so for a low-density designation in our guide plan, the zoning district might be R1 9.5, 13.5, R1 22, R1 44. When we get to the airport category, we've only identified 2 uses out of the airport, the area that's primarily aeronautical and the area that was primarily the safety zones. And so what we're doing is adding 2 areas to this chapter. We're going to identify A3 as an area for commercial uses. This is 12.79 acres. And the second color graphic that you have in the report, which is amended figure 3.4, shows the area in red, which is for commercial, and it shows the area in green, which is for office. The office area is approximately 57.57 acres. The second amendment that we have to our text in our comprehensive guide plan is going to be an amendment to page 520 and some amendment to the safety zone figures. Now, the amendment to page 520 that you have in the staff report, I have one small revision to this. In this particular page of the comp plan, we are going to eliminate the description of the area that describes the safety zone. Right now it says safety zone A is a no-build zone. It's 2/3 of the length of the runway and is to be maintained free of structures. We're simply eliminating that description and leaving it as safety zone A is a no-build zone. Safety Zone B was been limited to a limited development zone, and Safety Zone Z is a height limitation zone. Now, what I can tell you about the difference between the existing safety zones and the proposed safety zones is a change in the size of Safety Zone A. Safety Zone A gets compressed down to the runway protection zone, which is a federally designated area where you can't have building, and the B zone has gotten a little bit larger. So you have the one graphic that's all-encompassing, which is proposed figure 513. And maybe I'll show that. Maybe they can zoom in on this. I guess that's close enough. The area that's the dotted area is Safety Zone Z. That's the height limitation zone. I can tell you that anybody that has a single-family home in those areas are in conformance with the height limitations. It also shows proposed Safety Zone A and B. What figures 513A, 513B, and 513C is simply a close-up of the A and B zones, so you can see that in relationship to any of the properties that are nearby that particular part of the airport. The second part of what we need to look at is adoption of rules and regulations. And I'm going to go forward a couple of slides on this, and then I'll backtrack. We're going to talk a little bit about commercial standards. Now, the commercial standards that are proposed for the airport property are the same as the commercial standards we have for any commercial property in town. So you look at any of the restaurants around the Eden Prairie Mall, Redstone Grill, the Eden Prairie Mall. They have primarily brick and glass buildings, lots of landscapings. The parking lots are screened. You don't see the loading docks. They have infiltration basins and stormwater ponds to treat the stormwater. So this is something that we would expect MAC to do for any commercial use at the airport. The second thing that we're doing, and this is something we should do for any of our other commercial districts as well, we're adding in some rules and regulations relating to convenience gas. And the reason we're doing this is if you have a convenience gas that's near residential areas, we feel there should be some additional safeguards and mitigation measures to make it blend in better. And the first thing that this does is to take the building and orient the building towards the intersection and have the canopies towards the rear so you don't see the lights or the people that are parked at the gas pumps. The second thing it does is there's a limitation on the amount of lighting that you can have. Now, in the ordinance, it talks about 10-foot candles and 250 watts. If you went out into the parking lot at nighttime, when you leave here today, the parking lot wattage in there is about 250 per bulb. So it's going to look like most general office parking lots or commercial developments in town. Any of the other gas stations we have in town are probably 80 to 100-foot candles, and their wattage is probably 1,000 to 1,500. So if you've been there at nighttime, you know how bright that is. We don't think that bright of light is appropriate next to residential. We're also going to require landscape buffers to provide screening from adjacent residential uses, and we're going to require all of the buildings and canopies to be constructed out of brick and glass, and we're going to require them to have some relationship to residential areas. So we might be looking at a pitched roof. And this is not the best picture in the world, but I just wanted to give you an example of this. It's at the intersection of Anderson Lakes Parkway and Chestnut. And I think it's the Anderson Lakes Shopping Center. And this was done about 20 years ago. The architecture is a little bit dated. But what it shows here is that you have the canopy integrated into the building. You have apartments behind. So you've got the lighting and all the parking lot lighting away from the residential area. So that's what the intent of the ordinance is related to commercial and convenience gas retail. When we get into the office buildings, this is an example of an office building on Charleston Road. C.H. Robinson has a 3-story building on one side of the road. I think they lease a portion of the building, which is on the other side of Charleston Road, just north of Flying Cloud Drive. We're going to apply the same office standards to the office sites that are proposed here. So it's going to be a brick and glass building. You have the parking lot in front, the loading areas in the back. One of the reasons why we think office can be compatible next to residential is that most of the traffic's going to be Monday through Friday, 7 to 7, and it's generally very quiet on the evenings and weekends. Now, one more thing I want to talk about, which is something in our existing code, and it's really something that we would probably get into in more detail when we get to the site plan section, but that's going to be another 9 months to a year before we get down the road. And I want to talk about the site plan standards, and one in particular. Whenever we do a development next to another development where it's a difference in the land use, if you have office next to residential, commercial next to residential, we have a requirement for a transition. And what it says in here is where there are differences in land use, building mass, building height, density, site intensity, transitions are required and can be accomplished by increasing the setback. So let's say the office setback is normally 30 feet, maybe it's 50 feet, 75 feet, 100 feet. It also can take the form of smaller buildings, shorter buildings, increased berming, plantings, larger lot sizes, lower densities, lower floor ratios, and smaller buildings. So we have a couple of sites on here that are next to residential. So when we get to that phase and we start looking at where the houses are and where these houses are in elevation to the elevation of the property, we're going to take a very close look at how we make that fit in. So while the ordinance might state, from a capacity standpoint, that you could cover 30% of the property, the transition section might say you end up with 15% or 20% or some less number. The whole point is we want to save natural features because we know we have a creek that's going through the site that's along Eden Prairie Road. You've got a lot of nice natural vegetation and steep slopes. That's going to be protected by the state shoreline ordinance and our city code. The transition will help with that. We'll do the same thing over on the east side, which is next to the Hillsborough neighborhood. That site's going to be a little bit more challenging because it's kind of long and narrow, and so there's not a lot of horizontal dimension to be able to provide a transition and still provide room for berming. So I think that's going to be a little harder site to develop, even though I haven't seen a plan than the site that's on Eden Prairie Road. So that's a little bit of flavor of some of the things that are going to come, some of the other things we're going to talk about in considerably more detail. What I want to come back to is step 2 in the process. Step 1 tonight is simply regulatory tools. We're amending our comprehensive plan. We're amending our zoning ordinance, so the rules are in place. So when someone comes in to take a look at the zoning, we see how that fits. We're going to go through another process again, like this, in front of the Planning Commission and in front of the City Council. At that time, MAC will have a concept plan that's going to show the building on the property. We'll have a little bit of evaluation of how we think that stacks up with our site plan section of our code, even though we won't be looking at the actual building plans until later. That's going to be a 90 to 120-day process. So in order to get to step 2, Planning Commission has to make an advisory recommendation on step 1, and the council has to approve step 1. If we get through step 2 at the Planning Commission and step 2 at the City Council, we can move on to step 3. Now, I'm not quite sure when step 3 is going to happen because they have to identify a builder, and the builder is going to have the development plans. So this could occur as early as 6 months, it could be 9 months, it could be a year, it could be 2 years down the road. But we're still going to follow the same process, 90 to 120 days. Public hearing in front of the Planning Commission and City Council. We'll still notify property owners within 1,000 feet, and at that time, you'll be able to take a look at all the specific development plans for the property, the architecture, the site plan, the landscaping, the grading and drainage, those sorts of things that we typically would look at a development stage. So that's kind of an overview of the entire development process and an explanation about what actions are in front of the Planning Commission this evening, which are simply related to the guide plan and adopting some zoning rules and regulations.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Franson. Mr. Rosso, are you able to take questions from the audience regarding the presentation?
Or is that not appropriate for?
It would be appropriate for us to take your questions. It wouldn't be appropriate for the Planning Commission to start asking questions. We really need a meeting for that. But yes, certainly, if you have questions, clarifications you'd like to have answered, we can take those, and those who wish to stay for that certainly can.
Just, this is mainly to you, Mike, from a congruency with your comp plan? Does it, from I'm talking the specific airport office areas here. I mean, there's a distinct difference between the location of one of them with regard to single-family homes and the location of the other. I mean, it stands out in bold type that Zone 6 is almost completely surrounded by single-family homes. And the topography in that area, it seems odd that it would be congruent with your comp plan that office would be located in this area that it's completely exposed. There's no way, every homeowner would see anything that's built there.
This is on the Hillsborough property.
Exactly. Because of the topography.
The houses sit up higher
East side.
on the east side, and then you have a slope that goes down.
Yes.
And to build anything at the top of the slope would be highly visible. You'd have to build down at the bottom of the slope, and that's where it gets very narrow. Or you'd have to build closer to Pioneer Trail.
Right, and what I'm saying, if you build down in the low area, which is adjacent to the parks and the single-family homes, it would seem to be incongruent with your compatibility from a zoning standpoint. Like, you would think if anything, you could zone the next highest density residential as a logical buffer, but to have an office building that it would be completely visible to all 40 homeowners around there in this lower area, it seems a little odd to me that it could be considered congruent that this zoning fits your comp plan. And I'm also, by the way, a developer. I've had to sit in front of a lot of planning commissions with zoning changes, and this one just reeks of saying, geez, maybe you could put some 3 to 5 units per acre density zoning in there and maybe get away with that from a compatibility of use. But I mean, given the openness of this and given the adjacent park uses, it just seems odd that would be congruent.
I think there's an additional challenge with that site because there's a wetland that we've identified on our maps. And so the wetland, the buffer zones, and the wetland setbacks may preclude a lot of development from happening. When you get down into the lower portion towards the area that we call North Bluffs on the south end, I think that's the very low portion of the property, and that's where we see a lot of wetland in that area.
Thank you.
I just have one question.
Excuse me, sir, if there are a few other questions for city staff, since this is being broadcast on TV as well as online, just so that the people watching at home can hear the questions that are being had, if we could have you step up to the microphone. Appreciate it.
My question was, the MAC had dropped 2 areas that they were going to develop, and I was just curious why they had dropped those 2 areas.
Want to answer that, or do you want me to give an answer?
Good evening. My name is Bridget Rafe with the Metropolitan Airports Commission. One of the parcels was sited on the side slope of a hill along Charleston Road, and from a development standpoint, it just isn't going to work. So it doesn't make sense to carry that forward as a parcel. The other parcel is located such that that one really is surrounded by residential on all areas, and if it were to develop at some point in time, it would likely be residential. MAC's not really interested in developing residential, and so we have no position on that particular parcel, and at this time see no need to bring it forward as part of this process overall.
Sir?
Hi, my name is Mike Dungan. I own an office building that butts up to Area 7, which is office airport commercial. Do we know or yet have an idea what they're thinking of for that area? Obviously commercial, but Is it a strip mall? Do we know any details on it yet at this point in time?
We don't have any details at this point.
Okay, because it's a very narrow piece of property, so I was just curious to see if there was anything known about it.
I would say that maybe some of the narrow properties might be combined with other properties in the area.
Okay.
I know at one time we had a proposal that went through the Planning Commission and City Council process. It was Flying Cloud Retail. It's where the Cleve Heating and Air Conditioning building ends, which is opposite the Super America station.
Yep.
And at one time, they had approached MAC about having a lease on the property for more parking. And
Okay.
that didn't happen. And of course, the retail hasn't happened either.
Okay.
But that's what we see. Some of those parcels are so long and narrow.
Yeah.
It's questionable that you could even have a building that would meet the setbacks. So then you look at, would those parcels fit better with some of the existing office buildings and industrial buildings in the neighborhood?
Okay. Thank you.
I have a question regarding the change in the text that would affect the safety zones. What criteria was originally used to create Safety Zone A, and what has changed at the airport that would restrict that no-build zone down to the RPZ, which is a bare minimum set out by the FAA, as opposed to what we had in the past? The only thing I can see is that we have a longer runway, more airplanes and bigger airplanes, and we're shortening the safety zones. The other question regarding that, is this a precedence at Flying Cloud versus any of the other reliever airports? What are the safety zones at the other reliever airports?
I think I'll ask if Mac would talk about the safety zones and how they arrived at that.
The safety zones that are shown in the city's guide plan are similar to what have been shown in previous MAC planning documents. I want to state, though, that MAC's opinion is that there is no zoning in place right now at the airport. It has always been proposed zoning. Minnesota state statutes that the Department of Transportation Office of Aeronautics goes by has certain standards for safety zones. So if we have a 5,000-foot runway like we do at Flying Cloud, 2/3 of the length of 5,000 feet is safety zone A and 1/3 is zone B. That has always been proposed. A number of airports have that in place around the state. When it came time to do zoning for this particular airport, we put together a joint airport zoning board. It had members from the city of Eden Prairie, a couple of other cities, a couple members from MAC, and they, through some additional studies that they did, came to the determination that it made more sense for Safety Zone A to match the dimensions of the restricted runway protection zone, which is a federally protected zone, and that length is 2,500 feet, so it's 1/2 of the runway length instead of 2/3. It's not much of a difference. I'd have to refer you to the Joint Aviation Board documentation, and I can refer you after the meeting to a different staff member who actually ran the zoning process if you have real specific questions about the zoning. That document, an ordinance was prepared, it was adopted by that board, and was recommended to be submitted to the Department of Transportation for their review and approval, and that is where it stands at this point in time, is with the Department of Transportation. That's why it's considered proposed still at this time.
Do you have any further questions from the audience? All right, seeing none, that will conclude tonight's meeting. Again, this will be a continued item to our September 24th meeting in 2 weeks. So, thank you, everybody, for coming. We apologize again for the inconvenience.
Just close my